Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm seeing a few people joining us, and I imagine we'll have a few people coming over. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the second Informed States webinar. Informed States is a team of researchers that examines the equity and effectiveness of state higher education funding policies. If you missed our webinar last month where we discussed state funding for public higher education in the midst of COVID-19, it's available on our website, so you can check it out later. Today, we're excited to talk about equity and financial aid for cash-strapped states in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before diving in, let's start with some brief introductions. My name is Kelly Rossinger. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Education Policy Studies at Penn State University and a research associate in Penn State Center for the Study of Higher Education. I'll turn it over now to my Informed States colleague and co-principal investigator, Dominique Baker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dominique Baker, an assistant professor of education policy at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And they've decided to cut some grass at this time because that's what happens in my life. So at any moment, you may all of a sudden hear like buzzing of some sort. That's just the grass. We're all good to go. Just wanted to let you know.
Thanks, Dominique. Tiffany, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Jones. I lead the higher ed policy work at the Education Trust. We're a nonprofit policy and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C., focusing on students from low-income families and students of color from early education all the way through higher ed. So look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Tiffany. David?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Informed States team, for having me back for a second round here with the webinar series. I'm David Tamberg. I'm a senior vice president at the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. We're an association made up of those agencies that oversee, coordinate, and govern higher education within the states, and thrilled to be here.
Great. Thank you, Dominique, Tiffany, and David. We're thrilled to have you joining us today. In the way of a few quick programming notes, this work is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our other Informed States co-principal investigators, Justin Ortegas and Robert Kelchin, are joining us today in the room. Hi. I'll begin today with a short slideshow with some basic trends regarding funding for financial aid over time based on our team's recent policy brief, which may shape some of our conversation today. Then I'll pose some questions to each of our panelists. And during our discussion, Justin and Robert will be looking for questions from you all in the chat. So please type any questions that you have and we'll get to those later on. So to start our discussion of equity and financial aid for cash-strapped states, which I'm realizing is very hard to say, I'll share my screen. If you will bear with me while I click through Zoom. Great. So we'll start with an overview of state funding for need-based financial aid. Here we show, if I go forward one more, I'm sorry. The average share of state aid that is awarded based on financial aid over the last 2 decades. In the start of the period in 1998, you can see just under 85% of state financial aid was awarded based on need. We see that declining slowly over the period to an end of just under 75% in 2019. We see some small increases in recessionary periods. So the period that we're looking at here covers 2 recessionary periods that are in gray here. One shallow recession in 2001, and then the Great Recession from late 2007 to mid 2009. So you can see there's slight increases over prior recessionary periods in the share of state funding that's going toward financial aid. Next, we'll look at average state and local grant aid per student, specifically at four-year institutions, to try to understand how states and local governments, primarily states though, have allocated aid and the average amount that students receive at different types of institutions. So here we show non-MSI eligible institutions, so minority serving is what MSI stands for. HSI eligible, Hispanic serving institutions, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and primarily Black institutions. Again, we show these periods of recession in gray. You can see overall funding, the average share of state and local aid per student is highest at HSI eligible institutions, followed by non-MSI eligible institutions is light blue bar, and then followed by HBCU and PBI eligible institutions in dark blue. You can see over recessionary periods, there are sometimes small increases in the average state and local grant aid that students receive. And you can see some fluctuation in year-to-year volatility in all of these different institutional types, but particularly pronounced at HBCUs and PBIs over this time period. Here we show the same information, but now at two-year colleges, showing non-MSI eligible institutions in pink, HSI eligible institutions in red, and HBCU PBI eligible institutions in purple. Students at two-year colleges that are non-MSI eligible receive on average more financial aid from state and local governments, followed by HBCU and PBI eligible institutions, and then followed by HSI eligible institutions. Again, we see some volatility and fluctuation year to year over the time period we observe, but most kind of dramatic and pronounced in HBCU and PBI eligible institutions. As I stop sharing my screen, just want to highlight two kind of broader trends before we turn it over to our panel. The first is that over time, states appear to respond to recessions by slightly increasing the share of aid that they disperse based on financial aid, though that hasn't really changed the overall trend of a gradual decline in the share of need-based aid. And second, regardless of 2 or 4-year status, institutions face volatility in the average amount of state and local aid students receive, particularly at MSI eligible institutions, in ways that may make it difficult for these institutions to plan for how much aid students will end up receiving. So moving now to the present day and the budgetary implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturn, I'll turn it over to our wonderful panel to continue our discussion. I'll start by posing a question for each of our panelists. And as we do this and begin our discussion, please type any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll turn to those later on. So the first question that I'll pose is to Dominique and really focuses on what this all means. So Dominique, what can we expect to see going forward in the midst of COVID-19? And what are some lessons learned that can inform state policy regarding financial aid?
Yeah, so I think we sort of all accept that any sort of peering into the future that we're doing is highly suspect, right? So I definitely want to say that just right off the top. I think that realistically, there's a very real potential for sort of two things when I think about like, what do I worry about? What are the things that I think, like, how do we try to sort of get out ahead of them? One is that as we've sort of seen, there's a significant chunk of aid that is dispersed by merit, regardless of sort of how much that exact amount is, right? Like there is a chunk that is dispersed in that manner. But at the same time, right, we have these huge trends that are happening with test optional admissions, students not being able to take tests, students' GPAs being affected by the fact that their courses are going pass fail, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm actually not seeing any significant statewide conversations yet. They may definitely be happening privately, but any significant conversations about what that means for dispersing that merit aid. all of the facets of merit aid are being affected currently, whether or not you are currently enrolled in higher education or currently enrolled in high school. And so that I think is a big piece that we have to start thinking about. How are we going to adjust this? How are we going to think about this? Does this mean that aid becomes need-based? Or how else are we going to make sure that that's being dispersed equitably? And then the second thing that I puzzle a lot over from time to time is just that we know that states are going to have to reduce the amount of money that they give to higher education. It is highly unlikely without significant federal investment that states can even maintain what they provided to higher education from this previous year. And we know that we haven't seen the worst of it yet, because this is sort of a lagged experience. And so, but because of that, I think there is a danger in what we think of as, and I see that Elizabeth's on here, so she'll extra love this, but is one of the biggest dangers I think of is actually around the administrative burdens for students. And so that what could happen is, instead of doing a big push where we talk about how much money was reduced for students, what we do is we say, well, it's going to be priority applications for aid. All these sorts of things that may make it feel for some students like, oh, I still have a chance at that money, that then the students actually don't. You know, I think about, there's been a lot of research talking about Maryland and a couple of other states that have promise programs that had to actually sort of pull back on what they were going to be giving to students out of that promise program because of finances and the issues that they're having. And so those have big implications for affordability of higher education, but they also have big implications for students and residents' trust in sort of policies around aid and institutions, et cetera, which have much bigger repercussions for higher education as well. So those are two of the things that I think about.
Thank you, Dominique. For Tiffany, I think it's important to think about, as states face declining revenues in the coming years and make decisions about how to fund and allocate financial aid. A question for you is, what does this mean for students, especially when it comes to equity, and what do we need to think about moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just kind of building on Dominique's point about walking back some of the commitments that have been made due to budget cuts. Whether, promise programs, you're breaking a promise, right? Like, if that's the framing, and again, so much of the power of that movement is in the messaging. And so you see behaviors like increases in FAFSA completion and increases in enrollment. So it's as if, the public's doing their part to engage in response to these policy changes. And so I'm definitely very concerned. In fact, one example, in the state of Maryland, they've got almost 3,000 students on a waiting list that are otherwise eligible, that aren't going to receive those funds. So again, often we like to have a conversation when it comes, free college isn't perfect. We talk about how to design it in ways that it can be, best targeted to the students who struggle most to pay. But regardless, we're talking about dollars going from states towards helping students pay for higher ed that are not going to be there and aren't there already in a moment when higher ed really matters in terms of their economic recovery in this crisis. I think something else just to flag when we're thinking about students who struggle the most to pay and who they are, and and appreciate the data that was shared to start this conversation, also is thinking about the current crisis and how that it disproportionately impacts particular communities. So, Black and Latinx people are, 3 times as likely to get COVID, twice as likely to die if they do get it. And that has a ripple effect in terms of what's happening in the households of students, right? In terms of the care for their family members or themselves becoming ill. And so just those dynamics matter. And I just want to flag that because, of course, we're focused on being able to pay for college and the economic piece. And there are economic implications to getting sick and perhaps not having insurance or being out of work. But also just the social emotional well-being of students as well in this particular moment really matters. And so very concerned, and the early data on enrollment drops suggests that, again, it's really concerning that the the drops are bigger at community colleges. And I think one message or takeaway for folks thinking about financial aid and how to design it in the most effective ways is there's still a perception out there that community colleges are this affordable option. And so if that's the case, it's important to wrestle with, well, what's behind the fact that the drops are much larger at community colleges than they are at four-year institutions? I think it's a combination of who attends which types of institutions and the resources that they have, but also it's a challenge to the perception and the narrative that, again, community colleges are affordable for students. And again, it's not necessarily have to be a conversation limited to tuition. If we're looking at the full cost of attendance, so appreciate how that conversation is evolving, and there's more and more attention on those non-tuition costs, including that in data when we talk about cost of attendance at community colleges. So I think it's a combination of both, of who, those folks I was talking about being directly hit, those are the colleges they're more likely to attend. But I think there's also this idea during this economic crisis that if people can't afford to attend college, that includes community college as well. And so it's really concerning when, again, states aren't able to fund promise programs or whatever types of aid they're giving out. So.
Thanks, Tiffany. I really appreciate Tiffany and Dominique, especially bringing in a perspective of how students are navigating this and the promises that states have made to students. Turning to David, I'm curious if you're a state policymaker or a higher education agency officer making these decisions around financial aid, what are the types of decisions that states are going to have to make regarding funding aid?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Dominique and Tiffany, for the information and perspectives you shared. You definitely hit on what I would consider some of the most key issues in regards to the decision points for state policymakers relative to the very clear need that's out there amongst students and the citizens of the states, right? One of the challenges in talking about the decisions that states make is that there are multiple different decisions that are made within states by different entities and individuals, right? And so many of the decisions that impact students are made at the legislative level with the governor's signature, right? And that's the funding decision, so total dollar amounts. Many of the financial aid programs and state appropriations, that's where that decision is made. And the folks that make up our membership, so those working in state higher education agencies and system offices, provide information, advice, advocacy around how those, to inform those decisions, but ultimately often aren't making the decision themselves, or they're implementing the decisions that are made. And so, governors and legislators are impacted by so many things, right? There's the politics, there's the advocacy, there's the competing governmental areas, whether it's social welfare programs, transportation, corrections. Frankly, there are different politics involved when it comes to operating appropriations to institutions, need-based financial aid, and non-need financial aid. And it's becoming that those categories are getting a little bit harder to classify. And so with the advent of the Promise programs, it's really hard to know, are they merit aid? Are they are they non-need? Are they need? And you look at the NASGAP data and they fall out differently. The Tennessee Promise is in the other category. It's outside of the scope of what we generally look at. And I think policymakers don't really look at things from the categories that we as researchers might. And it really kind of makes things hard for us as researchers. But yet, at times I kind of wish that policymakers were to identify better the potential long-term impacts of the way they distribute or to whom they distribute their financial aid. And from that paradigm, that kind of need versus merit can be somewhat helpful, right? Whereas you think of, to put it in crude terms, where you're going to get the bang for your buck. My guess is it's the return on investment for these need-based financial aid programs, where the probability that you're going to potentially incentivize someone or enable someone to attend college who otherwise wouldn't have. And because it's need-based, you know, they're in the lower income brackets, moving them to an upper income bracket, and the long-term return is likely quite dramatic, rather than distributing funding based on merit, where one, they're already more likely to be in a higher income bracket and more likely to go to college anyways. And there are examples of states that have done really well in investing in need-based financial aid. Colorado, California, Texas are a few that come to mind. Not everyone has, and our merit aid programs are so politically stable that it's hard to ever claw back or redesign or discontinue one of those, whereas the same kind of political stability does not exist, I don't believe, for need-based programs. And they're also much quieter. They don't seem to get the attention that a traditional merit aid or a newer Promise program does, which personally I think is somewhat unfortunate.
Thanks, David. So we've talked a lot about some of the decisions that states may have to make and will have to make in the coming years. And we have a question that's come in about decisions states are currently making about how to allocate funds for the current fiscal year. And so I'm interested to hear, I think, David, this is a question I'll direct to you, but I welcome Dominique and Tiffany, your thoughts on this as well. The question is, in response to declining state revenues, will states consider rescinding previously promised increases in funding for financial aid allocations for the coming fiscal year? Do we have a sense yet? What is happening?
Wow, that's a really good question. It's certainly possible. I mean, we've seen changes to financial aid criteria in the face of constrained resources. Oregon's a good example of that, where it was started out as what you'd consider a Tennessee-esque traditional Promise program, and now it's a need-based program, and that was done because of they needed to ration because of constrained resources. I think that's possible. My guess, and it would be really interesting to look at the data on this, which I haven't done, is a more likely target for those kind of clawbacks or adjustments to appropriations or reductions is in appropriations rather than to institutions rather than financial aid. I think from a kind of political science perspective, you stand to lose a lot by taking money from individual citizens who thought they were going to get it versus taking it from abstract institutions. And so, yeah, it'd be a cool research study for you all at Informed States to do.
Well, and I was going to say, it seems that, like, from some descriptive things that we've seen from several sources, that plays out, that we see more dramatic dips for funding to institutions than we do for funding to students after recessionary periods. So that makes a lot of sense, that you don't want to sort of take the money that a student expected or a family expected away from them. And I was just going to throw in as well that some states are also pushing toward, we haven't talked as much about this because there are no national databases on this, but emergency aid has been a very big thing that's happening. And so I'm currently starting to do some stuff like trying to help the state of Texas think through what they've done with emergency aid so far. And I know a number of other states are doing similar pieces, but it is definitely the case where it's sort of this piecemeal approach of, do the states have some sort of emergency fund area, or can they find a funder who's willing to take a chance on them to throw some money? So in Texas, that's the Kresge Foundation, in addition to a couple of others who are channeling money that will be driven towards emergency aid for students. That is done in a fairly similar way I've seen to sort of CARES Act funding, but also allowed for spending for like food pantries, technology for students to make it easier for them to attend classes virtually, all those sorts of things. So I think that's also an area that is just, it's so hard to get an analysis of variation from state to state. But I do think that that is on the sort of radar of a number of states.
And I would just add, there are examples of discussing what that looks like in the future. So even if they're not removing a promise, let's say for the upcoming year, I know I've seen some public discussion about Excelsior and trying to figure out how they're going to rein it in to a certain extent so that they can fulfill their commitment to students who have already been a part of this program. But probably, to David's point about Oregon going to have to put some more restrictive criteria in place that might limit the pool further in terms of those who might be eligible in the future. And I think it's just important to keep an eye on how states are doing that, right? So it's not a bad idea that they're, I would say from our perspective, it's not the worst thing in the world that the program becomes more targeted if there's, in terms of income, if there's limited funds. And that might be a better way to target than, let's say, saying, oh, we're not gonna, add adult learners, right? Like, so just thinking about those who might be struggling the most to pay, if they're the ones who are going to be targeted at this time, that might be a more appropriate response than some of the other criteria, like let's add a GPA requirement, right? That might severely limit who's eligible. So yeah, just something to keep an eye on, as well as like what types of restrictive criteria are being put in place, especially for the more expansive promise and free college types of programs.
Thanks. Go ahead, David.
One thing that I think is important also when we talk about decision points for state policymakers and the potential for adjusting criteria or taking away money that because of a recession, recessions generally are really good to lottery revenue. And some of the merit aid programs, I think it's exclusively merit aid programs that are funded by lotteries, but I might be wrong. But big ones, Georgia Hope, Florida Bright Futures, probably the two biggest, both funded by lottery revenue. And that's meaningful that they're not constrained by the recessionary effects on state budgets in the same way that some of the other financial aid programs might be. And that's something to keep in mind as far as options and how these things kind of function.
Yeah, I'll just add, and it's also really concerning because of the demographics of who plays the lottery and then who are the recipients, especially like with Georgia Hope because of the GPA, types of requirements. So when you talk about shifting resources from under-resourced communities into those who, to David's point earlier about, families whose students were likely going to college anyway, with or without it. So it is, I think in some ways really concerning. And in some ways, one of the best things we hope that states would do is just put a pause on all merit aid programs unless they can fully fund their need-based aid programs as well at this time, to try to prevent some of that shift. And again, maybe shifting so that those dollars support need-based aid programs instead.
You all have perfectly transitioned us into the next question, which has to do with merit aid. And so knowing that many states, some we've mentioned already, have kind of these large merit aid programs that have been in place for decades in many cases, the question is, how can we think about designing merit aid programs with equity in mind? What are some strategies that we might look to make these programs more equitable? And I will turn it over to any and all of my colleagues and panelists to answer this one.
That's a hard one. Can it be done? I think would be where I would start. I think Tennessee's is maybe they kind of have multiple approaches to their financial aid built in. We kind of lump it all as merit aid, but it's more complex than that, with some deliberate efforts to direct some more financial aid towards those who may need it more than if you were to just go with a direct approach, a more direct merit aid program like you see in Georgia or Florida. That's a tough question. I don't know that I can really recommend a way to make a merit aid program more equity minded. I mean, not funded by a lottery would be another good thing. I had a grad student who did some analysis when I was at FSU looking at the lottery revenue by county, comparing it to college going rates and educational attainment by county. And, it was exactly what you would expect of a reverse correlation. I don't know, maybe people smarter than me like Dominique and Tiffany have better ideas. I'm kind of stumped by that one, Kelly.
I'm hesitating to go because I feel like my answer is not going to be productive in terms of the conversation, because my answer is like, this is a trick question. By nature, they are not equity minded. They can't be, and mostly because of the criteria by which they're based. And so, of course, there's a lot of attention on standardized test scores and the research, demonstrates the relationship between income and performance on those tests, and the limited and weakness of the research between the predictability in terms of ability and performance in terms of using standardized test scores. So it's exciting in this moment, all the things Dominique talked about in terms of in the admission space, that all of those things are being reconsidered because they have to be for this emergency. And I'm excited to see the survey from NACAC, where admissions professionals are reporting that they'll probably not bring some of these things back, which is helpful. And usually change process is much slower in higher ed. So that's one gift of the current crisis, I think. So I think merit aid would need to follow in some ways for all the reasons Dominique already highlighted. If it were to exist, it can't be mostly based off of test scores. Grades are better predictors of student performance. However, there are inequities baked in. EdTrust, our K-12 team, has done a lot of analyses around access to courses and lack thereof, especially around AP at schools that are serving more Black and Brown students. And even the schools that serve more Black and Brown students, if you look at who gets access to advanced placement courses and other college level coursework, there's a lot of inequities there. And so even just saying, okay, we'll flip it and use GPA would not be the silver bullet that would fix everything as well. Because GPAs, one of my old jobs was to recalculate GPAs when I worked in admissions. And I would watch GPAs jump from a 3.2 to a 3.8 because you're adding in bonuses for all the courses that someone had access to. And I'm watching certain high schools that are serving a lot of low income students, Black and Brown, and the students are taking every single AP course offered to them, and that's 2. So they can't even compete on the GPA level, if that makes sense. And so we had students going all the way up to a 4.5 at that time. And our average, this is a public university, average GPA was a 4.0. So I'm kind of honing in there because I think that's the natural instinct to say, let's just use grades instead. It's a better predictor of outcomes. It's fair. And I'm saying that is not the fix. When we're thinking about helping students pay, I think the most important question is, what resources do they have to pay for college, and how to use resources strategically to help those students the most who are struggling to pay, and not necessarily investing as much in, again, criteria that are based off of things like test scores and grades, which are indicators of privilege.
Yeah, and I was just going to throw in, so I'm currently doing this study looking at the feasibility of an admissions lottery. in selective colleges and universities. One of the biggest things whenever they look at or propose doing an admissions lottery, they say we need some sort of baseline level of assurance that a student can do the work. And so they normally say that this is either a GPA, a test score, or some combination. And so I've run several simulations and done a lot of other things trying to look at what happens if you actually created a lottery system and you looked at along GPA lines, along test score lines, or mixing them together. And what we sort of consistently find is that in and of itself does not create a more equitable entering class. And the reason that I bring this up is because of that sort of last point that Tiffany was making about the criteria. What this always comes back to is, well, is the criteria that you're using to measure so-called merit, is that sort of able to be evenly distributed along many different lines, race, class, et cetera, et cetera? If it's not, well, then the question becomes, how could it create a more equitable environment if we already know the types of issues that are sort of baked in to that? So our number one takeaway from the study that we did is that the criteria that allows someone to be eligible, whether that's eligible for admission to an institution or eligible for getting financial aid, that dictates everything about who has the potential to benefit from it.
Thanks, everyone. I think the next question, Dominique, I'll kind of direct it to you, but again, welcome David and Tiffany's thoughts on this one too. But you mentioned emergency aid. And so the question that Elizabeth asks, I'll say that because you sent this to everyone, but given the limited evidence that we have on the effectiveness of emergency aid, Elizabeth asks how policymakers are viewing the costs and benefits of these programs relative to more traditional aid programs.
So I think it's what's interesting about the sort of trade-offs for emergency aid is, as many of you on this may know, but I'll sketch out very quickly, the traditional forms of aid that come from need-based are reliant on the FAFSA. When did folks fill out the FAFSA for this academic year? And what information is it based on, right? So most people filled out the FAFSA many months ago, and that was based on income information from our prior year, from 2019's tax year. And so it's highly likely that people's original financial aid information has changed drastically due to layoffs, all sorts of things happening in relation to the pandemic. And so one of the benefits that isn't quite aligned with sort of the benefits that are talked about in prior research, in part, right, because all the other prior research wasn't on emergency aid in a pandemic, is that this emergency aid allows institutions to potentially get money to students for whom the FAFSA doesn't say that they have a need, but they most desperately do. Now, the part that becomes tricky about that, right, is, well, how do we find that out? So do we tell students that they have to fill out an essay to tell us that they need this money? Do we tell students that they have to show that somebody lost a job to get access to this money? All of those additional requirements chip away at those benefits that I was just talking about. Because then we go right back to, well, who are the savvy students who know to reach out? Who are the students who can get documentation to prove that they deserve whole different thing, but that they need this money. So I think that the trade-offs that are often being talked about, at least that I am hearing, are around they need to be able to get this extra money out because students have different need than they did when they submitted all their paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. We could say, right, that we're supposed to have a robust appeals process for the FAFSA that should allow for professional judgment to make additional decisions. But in those instances, you have to sort of prove that you have to be prepared to prove that the professional judgment decision that you made as a financial aid administrator was like a valid one to the federal government, in a way that when you do it for emergency aid, right, you're proving that to the funder, whoever is the funder of that emergency aid. So it can in some way sort of reduce the level of proof, the burden of proof necessary, which can make institutions feel a little more comfortable with putting out the money based on their judgment of which students need it. So those are some of the conversations that I'm hearing. But I agree you can't let targeting as much, like, I really want to make sure that I'm only targeting this to students who have lost a job, or someone in their immediate family has lost a job. Like, there's just, it's too much information to require students to have to share. It's one of the reasons, right? Uh, uh, Over the summer, one of the big issues that came up was a Dear Colleague letter that was released in 2009, I believe, where the Obama administration said that if students had certain types of social benefits, then they could automatically get full Pell, get all other sorts of things. This was in wake of the Great Recession, in order to sort of streamline some of this, remove some of the requirements, and just say, look, if this is happening, I'm gonna trust you, let's help you out. And so I think what I would like to see is a little bit more of, are there any sorts of things like that that we could say, if the students are, we already have this information and we know this, we're just going to start getting out the money to those students. I think that could go a long way. I think states also have a little bit of a role in this, and then I'm going to shut up, in that certain states in particular could do a lot with sort of mapping what they know of where there are students who have, where there are dark spots for strong Wi-Fi, where there are all sorts of resource shifts. And if a state does it right, they have larger capacity to be able to put that type of information together. That's something that they could share with institutions. And institutions could potentially say that, like, we're going to target technical funds to any student who lives in a census block or a zip code that has less Wi-Fi, right? Because I think one of the things that people have pointed to, Tiffany mentioned the drop in enrollment at community colleges, and one of the concerns some people have mentioned is that it can be much, there's potential that for these students who are served by community colleges, they have worse Wi-Fi in addition to additional care responsibilities and all sorts of things. And so, as an example, if you're saying that you're going to use these emergency funds for technology, is there a way that, based on information we already have, we can say these students are the ones that are going to get tech funds? Let's move this along.
Go ahead.
That was funny. Tiffany and I are watching each other's mute buttons. I would just add, I'm trying to get the study, but I recall a study in the last few years that was showing that how even a small amount of money that's timely distributed in a real timely way can make a rather big difference in a student's decision to stay enrolled. Maybe one of you recall the study. I'll find it and send it out. But anyways, I think there is some potential for emergency aid distributed in the way that Dominique mentioned to be rather effective. I think timeliness and having it be quite targeted is probably two things that would make a big difference. One thing that Dominique said that I would like to pick up on is the role that states can play in identifying students who could really benefit. And they have all of these separated data systems, where the unemployment data system, I think, targeting people who were recently unemployed, who may not know they can get financial aid or the amount of financial aid, or that they can make changes to their FAFSA because they're unemployed. Likewise, the data from their kind of social welfare programs, just letting them know, hey, we can quickly populate your FAFSA. You can get this much money if you file and go to college. Likewise, working with tax people who tax accountants. We know from research that that's a prime time to fill out a FAFSA for people who wouldn't otherwise have considered it or know that they ought to. There's a lot of innovations in those areas that can work with existing financial aid need-based financial aid programs in particular, that may not sound as cool as, starting a brand new Promise program, or, that could probably make a lot of difference for many students, just using existing infrastructure that is largely left unutilized right now, which I think is really unfortunate. I'll stop there.
And the only thing is, just really quickly, I would add, I get nervous about emergency aid framing as a long-term solution. And so I think it's definitely it's been the right thing to do. It's definitely the right thing to do right now because we are in a crisis, right? And things are changing very fast for students. So, but that's where I feel like the emergency aid strategy belongs, right? In response to crisis. And so it's just a reminder when it comes to policy solutions, that this is not I get nervous because I've seen proposals at the federal level that's like trying to institutionalize emergency aid in a way that I get concerned it is replacing a conversation that should be had about doubling Pell or more, right? Or things that this aid should be there. To Dominique's points around accessibility, it shouldn't be complicated for students. It should be automated to a certain extent. So I get worried about special initiatives from programs and a bunch of different funders trying to piecemeal, infrastructure together. So I love David's point about using the data, linking data systems to make this more automated, and Dominique's examples as well. And again, to be efficient about how you respond to crisis, but we already know ahead of time that these students don't have the resources. So there has to be some bigger changes around, just reconfiguring our whole system that right now is mostly debt financed, right? And making sure, again, students have the aid they need to pay for college upfront. And again, I that's my only concern is that it can, I feel like sometimes it's like replacing this conversation around like, but what is there, what's the foundation? Emergency aid should be, again, in response to a particular crisis, it should be easy for students to access and for administrators to distribute, but it is not a replacement for our broken financial aid system. In fact, I think it would make things much more complicated.
Thank you. One other strategy we've seen states move toward in recent years is kind of tuition caps or freezes to address or attempt to address college affordability concerns. And do you anticipate in the coming years, as states face budget cuts, that they may lift restrictions or freezes or caps on tuition to allow colleges to generate revenues that way?
I'm not sure. Again, there's only certain states where either politicians or the SHIO agency controls tuition. I mean, there are good a number of examples. Some of them set bans, others operate as an approving entity. But it's a real different political situation when a state is making that decision that's going to negatively impact citizens versus when the institution makes that decision, right? It's much easier for an institution to do it because they're not going to be elected, right, than for a legislature to do it. They may need to, and again, that would be another really cool study that wouldn't be that hard to do, is identify those states, the level of where the tuition setting authority lies, and see if what decisions they make. At SHIO, we collaborated on a study and others have done this too, that we're not the only ones, that tuition tends to be lower when a state agency or the legislature controls tuition. It has a dampening effect on tuition increases. And that makes complete sense, right? So I tend to think that would be a pretty last resort move, but definitely possible, wouldn't be surprised.
Only thing I would add is that I anticipate a lot of pushback, just because of where the public conversation is around college affordability and debt. Doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. I trust David would know that better than I do, but I can just say on the advocacy side, I would imagine a lot of pushback. And the other kind of dynamic to remember is there's increasingly a conversation less about how do you split up the higher ed pie, but how do you split up all the funds? And so it's likely states might feel like colleges need the flexibility to increase tuition if they're going to gut their higher ed budgets. But I also think there's some public pressure that's increasing around this idea of like, what are those other things that states are investing in that shouldn't be maintained or increased at this time that might alleviate some pressure around higher ed as well. I think incarceration and policing is probably the most obvious one. And there's good data that demonstrate during the last recession, as the higher ed budgets went like this, the spending on incarceration in many states continue to increase. And so again, I've seen that conversation happening outside of higher ed circles when people talk about decarceration. Others have talked about it as just like reinvesting in the things that matter, like housing, education, all of the list goes on. And so I think that that's a dynamic at play that could have an impact on how much pressure institutions will be under and how much states might be, gutting that budget.
I have a question that I'll pose to each of the panelists. What do you see as the most important financial aid issue for states that people just aren't really talking about? Maybe one of the, if not the most important.
Okay, I'll take a stab. Beyond anything, I guess, that we've already talked about, or maybe not. I guess, yeah, I guess I come back to, well, a thing we haven't talked about yet that I will mention is actually satisfactory academic progress. So often, in order for people, yes, this is what happens when you go first, it's mine. So, right, often in order to keep financial aid in subsequent years, you have some sort of satisfactory academic progress. And so this I put into a similar bucket with my concerns around both merit aid, but also what David was talking about, the fact that we have a lot of need-based aid that all of a sudden starts sneaking in some GPA here and things here, that in addition, satisfactory academic progress, I worry that we're not having conversations about whether or not people are going to lose access to their aid at both the state level or the federal level because of all the things. Like, for anyone here who is not currently teaching or engaging with students on the regular, students are struggling. I think we all are, but like students are struggling with putting everything in and still feeling like they're only getting like 50% of the way there. And so I think we're going to see a lot of students' GPAs drop, and that could have real impact on their ability to access financial aid in the future.
Dang it, Dominique. Yeah, totally got that one. It's funny. Jason Lee on the staff here at SHIO, he and I spent like 30 minutes talking about satisfactory academic progress. I'm like, yeah, I'll bring it up on the webinar. Oh, well. No, I mean, I don't know that I have anything that hasn't already been brought up, but the advice I do and would give to our members and anyone else in a position of influence within the states is the goal has to be to get out as much money as quickly and as efficiently as possible to the students who need and stand to benefit the most. And I think we've hit on a lot of ideas for how that could be done better. And yeah, anytime state resources are scarce and sacred, but never more so than right now, where one, they're more scarce, they're scarcer, but also the need is the greatest. And so I think that's the goal. And I think we've hit on a lot of strategies for how that could be done better. And so I would just highlight that and I would loop in absolutely Dominique's point about satisfactory academic progress. And in effect, I think every one of our need-based financial aid programs, large scale ones, have that as a component. And so they're all a little bit merit just a little bit, but yeah, we should include that in our policy discussion.
And I'll just add quickly, we probably didn't talk as much today about kind of the unique barriers to financial aid for students that you're trying to re-engage in higher ed. And I say that because at Trust, we do quite a bit of work around the intersections of criminal justice and higher ed, and talking about, have a great shiny program, but people can't participate if they have unaddressed issues around default or some other type of financial aid as a barrier to being able to re-engage with higher ed. And I think it matters right now because of the drops in enrollment we're seeing. So we're gonna have even more disengaged folks that of course will be really important during a recession to get back engaged in higher ed, and figuring out making sure there's focus on the number of policies that can, like how to reconcile if you have defaulted on federal loans, or just eligibility. Honestly, criteria for most programs are targeted towards first time, full time, coming right out of high school, and what the implications may be for this perhaps growing group in the upcoming years will be important.
I would highlight that and maybe put a fine point on one element of it that, again, Jason and I were talking about this morning, is that is it really fair to hold someone to their GPA that they had 25 years ago or 10 years ago? They're a different person, and erasing that, whether that SAP requirement or eligibility requirements, would go a long way in our re-engagement. But we'd have to go beyond that in the way that Tiffany mentioned, like incarceration and other factors, but just to emphasize that a bit.
Thanks, everyone. In the 1 minute that we have remaining, I have one more question for each of you. What is, if there's one or two key takeaways that state policymakers could have from our conversation today, what would that be?
A quick one, it would be, even in the face of budget cuts, you can still make decisions about investments with equity in mind. And that means prioritizing the needs of the students who are struggling the most to pay at the moment. And the same thing would be true of thinking about investments in the colleges they're most likely to attend. And so again, that doesn't require new money. It doesn't erase the fact that cuts may be happening. It's just all about prioritizing where the resources go at that point, and being willing to kind of face the political pressures that come along with cuts to otherwise institutions or communities that have a lot of political power. But in this moment, because of all the things we've already talked about, it's critically important because these are students who, without the additional resources, won't be able to engage in higher ed at all.
I will say yes to everything that Tiffany said. I'll just throw in that means all students that you are educating, and not necessarily your idealized student who you wish you were educating, because that ties back in with, right, like I try to catch myself when I talk about merit aid, that I want to speak as expansively as possible, because we have students who are attending community colleges who might want to transfer. Like, we have all sorts of students who come to higher education, or students who are not currently enrolled in anything, who might be interested in coming back. And so I think it's thinking about the fullness of who are your constituents. Who are the people that you want to help join in this journey of education and learning? And then what are their barriers to doing that, and seeing how you can help to target towards them.
Yeah, I mean, ditto to both of what Dominique and Tiffany said. I think they likely put it much better than I ever could. I just think about the role of policymakers, and in particular SHIO agencies. I mean, they're ultimately supposed to look out for the greater public good and interest, and give voice to those who really need government intervention to overcome systemic issues like racism and classism, poverty, the like. And I would hope that they would keep that in mind and make it actionable through policy. that's the role that no one else can really play at that kind of system level. We're really dependent on them, and and so reminding them that that's their mission and purpose, and giving them ideas for how they can actually put it into effect in the way they design policies. So yeah, I think I'd just leave it there.
Great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks to our great panel, to our great participants. We'll post this webinar to our Informed States website in the coming weeks. And don't forget to check out our last webinar on state funding for public higher education. Thank you again, everyone, for taking time to be with us today. Stay safe and healthy, and thanks.